The icy wind cut through General George Washington's wool coat like a blade as he stood on the Pennsylvania shore of the Delaware River, watching his ragged army huddled around meager fires. It was December 23, 1776, and the Continental Army was on the brink of collapse. Men wrapped their bleeding feet in torn cloth, leaving crimson trails in the snow, while others simply sat in stunned silence, their muskets frozen to their hands. Washington's weathered face betrayed none of the desperation gnawing at his chest. In just 9 days, on January 1st, 1777, the enlistments of most of his soldiers would expire. The cause of American independence, which had burned so brightly after the Declaration 6 months earlier, now flickered like a candle in a hurricane. The British had driven his forces from New York, across New Jersey, and now held most of the colony's major cities. Many patriots had already sworn allegiance to King George III, accepting British pardons in exchange for their lives and property. The general's aide-de-camp, Colonel Alexander Hamilton, approached through the snow, his young face grave with concern. "Sir, the men are beginning to desert in greater numbers. Some have already started for home." Washington nodded grimly, knowing that each departing soldier took with him not just a musket, but a piece of hope that grew smaller with each passing hour. Behind them, the lights of Trenton flickered across the Delaware River like distant stars. The town was occupied by Hessian mercenaries, German soldiers hired by the British Crown to crush the rebellion. Johann Gottlob Raoul commanded nearly 1,500 professional warriors, men who had fought in European wars and viewed the American colonists as little more than farmers playing at soldier. They had settled into winter quarters, confident that Washington's defeated army posed no threat, according to historical accounts documented in the Smithsonian's archives. Washington had been contemplating a desperate gambit for days. The intelligence reports from his spy network painted a clear picture. The Hessians, celebrating Christmas in the German tradition, would likely be unprepared for an attack. It was a slim hope, but perhaps the only one remaining. As darkness fell over the frozen landscape, Washington called his officers to a council of war in a nearby farmhouse. The candlelight flickered across the faces of men who had already sacrificed everything for the cause. General Nathaniel Greene, despite his youth, had proven himself a capable commander. Colonel John Glover commanded the Marblehead Regiment, experienced fishermen and sailors who knew boats in rough water. These men would be crucial to any plan involving the treacherous Delaware. "Gentlemen," Washington began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to propose, "we stand at a crossroads. We can retreat further, watch our army dissolve, and surrender our cause to history's judgment. Or we can strike one bold blow that might change everything." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen river, carrying with it the fate of an unborn nation. Washington's eyes met those of each officer in turn, reading their faces for the courage he would need to borrow. The decision that would be made in this humble farmhouse would echo through the ages, determining whether the American experiment would survive its first winter or perish in the Pennsylvania snow. The morning of December 24th dawned gray and bitter, with snow beginning to fall in earnest across the Delaware Valley. Washington stood before his assembled officers in the cramped farmhouse, a rough map of Trenton spread across the wooden table. The plan he outlined was audacious to the point of madness, yet it carried the seeds of redemption for a dying cause. "We will cross the Delaware tonight," Washington announced, his finger tracing the route on the map. 3 separate crossings, coordinated to strike Trenton from multiple directions at dawn on December 26th. The officers exchanged glances, recognizing both the brilliance and the desperate nature of the scheme. Colonel Glover leaned forward, studying the river conditions they would face. The main force, 2,400 men, under Washington's direct command, would cross at McConkey's Ferry, 9 miles north of Trenton. A second force under Colonel John Cadwalader would cross further south to engage British reinforcements. The third crossing, led by General James Ewing, would secure the bridge over a Sun-Pink Creek, cutting off Hessian escape routes. General Greene raised the obvious concern that haunted every man in the room. "The river is choked with ice, and the weather is worsening. Our men are already weakened by cold and hunger. To attempt a night crossing in these conditions, .. He left the sentence unfinished, but the implications hung heavy in the winter air. Washington's response revealed the depth of his understanding of their situation. The very severity of the weather works in our favor. Nathaniel, the Hessians will not expect an attack in such conditions. They will be warm in their quarters, perhaps celebrating their Christmas traditions. We must use their confidence against them. The logistical challenges were staggering. The Continental Army possessed only a handful of boats, mostly Durham boats used for hauling iron ore down the Delaware. These flat-bottomed vessels, typically 40 to 60 feet long, would need to carry not just soldiers but also their essential artillery. Colonel Alexander Hamilton, serving as Washington's artillery chief, would oversee the transport of 18 cannon across the treacherous waters. As reported in David Hackett Fisher's definitive work Washington's Crossing, the general's attention to detail during the planning phase proved crucial to the operation's success. Every aspect was considered. The passwords for the night operation, the distribution of ammunition, the selection of guides familiar with the roads to Trenton, and the timing that would bring three separate forces together at precisely the right moment. The afternoon brought disturbing news from the intelligence network. A Pennsylvania farmer, loyal to the Crown, had been captured attempting to warn the Hessians of unusual American activity. Washington ordered the man detained, but the incident reminded everyone how precarious their security remained. One leaked word could transform their surprise attack into a massacre. Washington spent the remaining daylight hours moving among his troops, speaking quietly with small groups of soldiers. He did not make grand speeches or promise easy victory. Instead, he reminded them of what they were fighting for: the right to govern themselves, to raise their children in freedom, to build something new in the world. Many of these men had been with him since the siege of Boston, had watched him grow from a Virginia planter into the leader of a revolution. As evening approached, the general made his final preparations. He wrote letters to be delivered in case of his death, updated his will, and prayed briefly in the privacy of his tent. The weight of command had aged him visibly in the past months, but his resolve had only strengthened. Tonight would determine whether the American cause would live to see another spring or die in the frozen waters of the Delaware River. The wind howled like a banshee across the Delaware as Washington's army began assembling at McConkey's Ferry late on Christmas night. Snow fell in thick sheets, driven horizontal by the gale, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. The temperature had plummeted well below freezing, turning the falling snow into a mixture of sleet and ice that stung exposed skin like needles. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment took charge of the boats, their experience as Massachusetts fishermen proving invaluable in the treacherous conditions. These hardy New Englanders had spent their lives battling the North Atlantic, but even they had never attempted anything quite like this. The Durham boats, loaded with ice that had to be constantly broken away, bobbed dangerously in the current as chunks of river ice crashed against their hulls. Washington himself stepped into the lead boat at approximately 11 o'clock that night, his tall frame silhouetted against the snow-filled darkness. He had wrapped his dark blue cloak tightly around his uniform, but the bitter wind still cut through to his bones. Beside him sat his most trusted officers: Greene, who would lead the left column in the attack; General John Sullivan, commanding the right; and young Hamilton, responsible for ensuring the artillery reached Trenton intact. The crossing proceeded with agonizing slowness. Each boat required multiple trips back and forth across the ice-choked river, and the treacherous conditions claimed precious time with every voyage. Men stumbled and fell on the icy banks, their frozen fingers unable to grip their muskets properly. Several soldiers suffered frostbite severe enough to require immediate attention, but there was no time for proper medical care. As documented in the Pennsylvania Historical Society's archives, the artillery presented the greatest challenge of the crossing. The 18 cannon, ranging from light field pieces to heavy siege guns, had to be loaded carefully into the Durham boats to prevent capsizing. Colonel Hamilton supervised every movement, understanding that without artillery support, the attack on Trenton would likely fail. The horses, essential for moving the guns once they reached the New Jersey shore, were perhaps the most difficult cargo of all, their terror of the icy water and crashing ice making them nearly unmanageable. By 2 o'clock in the morning, it became clear that the original timetable was impossible to maintain. Washington had planned to have all his forces across by midnight, allowing a 4-hour march to Trenton and an attack at dawn. Now, with the crossing only half complete, the general faced a crucial decision: abort the mission or press forward, despite the delay. The other two crossing points were reporting severe difficulties. Colonel Cadwallader's force had managed to get some men across, but could not transport their artillery through the ice-packed river. General Ewing's troops were completely unable to cross, leaving the bridge at a Sunpink Creek unguarded. Washington's force would attack Trenton alone without the coordination that had been central to the plan. As the hours passed, the storm intensified. Men collapsed from exhaustion and cold, their comrades dragging them to the boats by sheer force of will. The password for the night, victory or death, seemed increasingly prophetic as the soldiers struggled against the elements. Some officers quietly suggested abandoning the assault, but Washington refused to consider retreat. Private John Greenwood, a 16-year-old fifer from Boston, later wrote in his diary about the crossing, "I have never experienced such a night. The wind seemed to blow through my very soul, and the ice cut my face until I thought I would bleed to death. But still we pressed on, for we knew that everything depended on reaching the other side." By 4 o'clock in the morning, the last of Washington's 2,400 men had finally reached the New Jersey shore. They were hours behind schedule, soaked to the skin and half frozen, but they were across. The general stood on the riverbank, watching his army form ranks in the pre-dawn darkness, and knew that they had already achieved something remarkable simply by surviving the crossing. Now came the real test. Could these exhausted, frozen soldiers march 9 miles through a blizzard and defeat a garrison of professional warriors? The Continental Army began its march toward Trenton at 5 o'clock in the morning. 3 hours behind Washington's original schedule, snow continued to fall heavily, creating a white curtain that both concealed their movement and made navigation treacherous. The general had divided his force into 2 columns. Greene's division would approach Trenton from the north, while Sullivan's men would strike from the west, cutting off escape routes toward Princeton. Washington rode between the 2 columns, its presence a steadying force for men who had reached the very limits of human endurance. Many soldiers had wrapped their feet in rags, leaving a trail of bloody footprints in the snow. Others stumbled forward in a daze, supported by their comrades, their muskets frozen to their hands. The bitter wind cut through their thin uniforms as if they were naked, but they pressed on, driven by something deeper than mere duty. The march tested every man's resolve. Private David Howe of the Massachusetts militia later recalled in his pension application, "We marched through snow that came up to our knees, and the wind was so fierce that we could barely see the man in front of us. My feet were so cold I could not feel them, and my hands were so numb I could not load my musket. But still we marched, for we knew that General Washington was depending on us." As they moved through the New Jersey countryside, Washington's scouts brought disturbing news. A Hessian patrol had spotted American soldiers in the area, though the storm had prevented a clear count of their numbers. Colonel Raoul had been notified, but according to intelligence reports, the German commander had dismissed the sighting as a minor probe, not worthy of disrupting his men's Christmas celebrations. The artillery proved especially challenging to move through the deep snow. Hamilton's gunners, under the command of Captain Alexander Hamilton and Lieutenant James Monroe, had to drag their pieces by hand when the horses could no longer pull them through the drifts. These young officers, both destined for greatness in the new nation, worked alongside their men, their hands bleeding from the frozen ropes and their faces raw from the wind. As documented in the Library of Congress's collection of Revolutionary War correspondence, Washington's leadership during this march became legendary among his troops. He dismounted his horse repeatedly to walk beside struggling soldiers, offering quiet words of encouragement. When one young private collapsed in the snow, Washington himself helped lift the boy to his feet and ensured he was assisted by his comrades. The 2 columns maintained communication through a series of guides who knew the local roads. These men, mostly local farmers, sympathetic to the patriot cause, risked their lives to ensure Washington's army reached its destination. They navigated by memory through the blinding snow, their intimate knowledge of every fence and farmhouse proving invaluable. By 7 o'clock in the morning, advance scouts reported that they were approaching Trenton's outskirts. The storm was beginning to ease slightly, but the snow continued to fall, muffling sound and limiting visibility. Washington called a brief halt to allow his men to check their weapons and prepare for battle. Many discovered that their muskets were too wet to fire, forcing them to rely on bayonets for the coming fight. The general addressed his officers one final time before the attack. Gentlemen, we have come this far against impossible odds. Our men have crossed an ice-choked river in a blizzard and marched 9 miles through snow that would stop ordinary soldiers. They have done this not for pay, for they have received none, nor for glory, for few will remember their names. They have done this for liberty itself. As the Continental Army formed for battle in the gray dawn light, Washington looked toward Trenton, where smoke rose from the chimneys of houses where Hessian soldiers slept, aware that their Christmas morning was about to become a day of reckoning. The die was cast, and the fate of American independence now hung in the balance of the next few hours. The attack on Trenton began at 8 o'clock in the morning on December 26, 1776, when the first American soldiers burst from the swirling snow into the startled Hessian outposts. The sentries, half frozen and drowsy from their Christmas celebrations the night before, barely had time to fire their muskets before being overwhelmed by Continental soldiers who seemed to materialize from the storm itself. Greene's column struck from the north, his men charging down King Street with fixed bayonets, while Hamilton's artillery rumbled into position at the head of the street. The young artillery officer, barely 21 years old, directed his gun crews with precision that belied his age, positioning his cannon to sweep the length of the street with devastating effect. The first blast of grapeshot tore through the morning air, announcing to the sleeping town that the Americans had arrived. Simultaneously, Sullivan's division poured in from the west, their approach along River Road catching the Hessians completely off guard. The German soldiers, professional warriors who had fought in European campaigns, found themselves facing an enemy they had been told was defeated and demoralized. Instead, they confronted men who fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. Colonel Johann Gottlob Raoul, the Hessian commander, was roused from his bed by the sound of gunfire and the shouting of his officers. Still groggy from the previous night's festivities, he stumbled into the street in his nightclothes, trying to comprehend how the Americans had managed to mount such an assault. His trained eye quickly assessed the situation. His forces were caught between 2 converging columns, with artillery commanding the main streets. The battle raged through Trenton's narrow streets with a fury that surprised both sides. Hessian soldiers, despite being caught unprepared, attempted to form battle lines and deploy their own artillery. They managed to unlimber 2 of their cannon in the town square, but American marksmen, many of them experienced hunters from the frontier, picked off the gun crews with deadly accuracy. When the Hessians tried to reload, Washington's infantry charged forward, capturing the guns in brutal hand-to-hand combat. As reported in the detailed accounts preserved in the Morristown National Historical Park archives, the turning point came when Washington himself appeared on horseback in the center of the fighting. His presence galvanized the Continental troops, who had been fighting in separate engagements throughout the town. The general, his dark cloak billowing in the wind, directed the battle with calm authority, his voice carrying over the din of musket fire and cannon blast. Private John Greenwood, the young fifer who had crossed the Delaware, found himself in the thick of the fighting on King Street. Years later, he would write, "I saw General Washington ride right into the center of the battle, bullets flying all around him like hail. He never flinched, never showed fear, just pointed his sword toward the enemy and called for us to follow. We would have followed him into hell itself." The Hessians, realizing their position was hopeless, attempted to retreat toward the Assunpink Creek Bridge, their planned escape route. However, without General Ewing's force to block the bridge, they found their way contested by American troops who had worked their way around the town's perimeter. Colonel Raoul, mortally wounded while trying to rally his men, fell from his horse in the snow, his blood staining the white ground crimson. The fighting lasted barely 90 minutes, but its intensity burned itself into the memory of every participant. When the smoke cleared, nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers had been captured, with only a handful managing to escape. The Continental Army's casualties were remarkably light, 4 wounded and 2 dead from freezing, not enemy fire. Among the wounded was Lieutenant James Monroe, who had been struck by a musket ball while serving with the artillery. As the sound of battle faded, Washington's exhausted soldiers began the process of securing their prisoners and gathering the substantial supplies they had captured. The generals surveyed the scene with quiet satisfaction, knowing that they had achieved far more than a tactical victory. They had proven that the Continental Army could still fight, still win, and still surprise the world's most powerful military forces. The question now was whether they could hold on to what they had won. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Trenton revealed the full magnitude of Washington's gamble and its spectacular success. As his soldiers rounded up nearly 1,000 Hessian prisoners, including 37 officers, the general walked through the streets of the captured town, serving the evidence of their remarkable victory. The Continental Army had seized 6 brass cannon, 40 horses, and a treasure trove of military supplies that would keep them fighting for weeks to come. More importantly than the material gains, however, was the psychological impact of the victory. Word of the triumph spread like wildfire through the colonies, reigniting the flame of resistance that had nearly died in the winter snows. Patriot newspapers, which had been publishing increasingly desperate pleas for support, suddenly trumpeted the news that Washington's army lived and could still deliver devastating blows to the enemy. The captured Hessian officers, professional soldiers who had dismissed the Americans as amateur rabble, found themselves face to face with the reality of their situation. Colonel Raoul, dying from his wounds, was carried to a house where he was treated with the courtesy due his rank. Before his death, he reportedly expressed amazement at the discipline and fighting ability of the Continental soldiers. Admitting that he had gravely underestimated his opponents, Washington faced an immediate strategic dilemma. His original plan had called for a quick strike and immediate withdrawal back across the Delaware. But the magnitude of their success opened new possibilities. The Hessian garrison at Trenton had been eliminated, but British forces at Princeton and New Brunswick would soon respond to the disaster. The general had to decide whether to consolidate his gains or risk everything on an even bolder gambit. The condition of his army remained precarious despite their victory. The men who had crossed the Delaware were still exhausted, cold, and hungry. Many had fought the entire battle with muskets that would not fire due to wet powder, relying solely on bayonets and determination. The promised reinforcements from the other crossing points had never materialized, leaving Washington's force isolated on the wrong side of the river. As documented in the George Washington papers at the Library of Congress, the general spent the afternoon of December 26 writing dispatches to the Continental Congress and 2 other commanders, describing the victory and its implications. He was careful to give credit to his officers and men, particularly praising the leadership of Greene and Sullivan and the courage of the artillery crews, who had performed so magnificently under fire. The treatment of the Hessian prisoners became a defining moment in Washington's character as a leader. Despite the brutal nature of the fighting and the desperate circumstances of his army, he ordered that all captives be treated with dignity and respect. The wounded were given medical attention. The officers were allowed to retain their personal belongings, and all prisoners were provided with food and shelter. This magnanimity, unusual in 18th century warfare, enhanced Washington's reputation and demonstrated the moral principles underlying the American cause. As evening approached, Washington made his crucial decision. Rather than retreating immediately across the Delaware, he would hold Trenton through the night and evaluate the situation in the morning. This choice required enormous confidence in his men's ability to fight again if necessary. But it also signaled to the world that the Continental Army was no longer merely surviving, but actively campaigning. The news of the victory reached the Continental Congress in Baltimore, where representatives had fled after the British capture of Philadelphia. The impact was immediate and profound. Delegates who had been discussing the possibility of seeking peace terms suddenly found themselves debating how to support Washington's renewed offensive. The victory at Trenton had transformed the political landscape as dramatically as it had changed the military situation. That night, as his army slept in the captured town, Washington stood watch in the house that had served as Rawls' headquarters. The intelligence reports spread across the table before him painted a picture of British forces converging on Trenton from multiple directions. The victory had been magnificent, but it had also painted a target on his army's back. The next few days would determine whether the triumph at Trenton would be remembered as the turning point of the war or merely a brief flash of hope before final defeat. The morning of December 27th dawned clear and cold over Trenton, revealing the full scope of Washington's strategic situation. British forces under Lord Cornwallis were marching south from New York, with over 8,000 troops, while additional forces from Princeton and New Brunswick were converging on the captured town. The Continental Army, still numbering only about 2,400 men, faced the prospect of being surrounded and destroyed within hours. Washington's decision to remain in Trenton overnight had been both bold and dangerous, but it allowed him to gather crucial intelligence about British movements and prepare for the next phase of his campaign. The general understood that the victory at Trenton, while psychologically important, would mean nothing if his army was subsequently annihilated. He needed to extract his forces and their prisoners safely, while maintaining the momentum of their success. The evacuation of Trenton began at noon on December 27th, with Washington personally overseeing the withdrawal. The Continental Army had learned valuable lessons about river crossings during their Christmas night adventure, and the return journey proceeded much more smoothly despite the burden of nearly 1,000 prisoners and captured supplies. The weather had cleared, eliminating the storm that had both hindered and hidden their original crossing. The impact of the Battle of Trenton extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. Throughout the colonies, Patriot militias that had been dormant during the dark days of December began to reassemble and take the field. The victory proved that the British and their mercenaries were not invincible, that disciplined American forces could defeat European professionals in direct combat. This psychological transformation was perhaps more valuable than all the captured cannon and supplies combined. As recorded in the detailed analysis by the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, the battle marked a fundamental shift in the character of the Revolutionary War. Prior to Trenton, the conflict had been largely defensive on the American side, with Washington's forces retreating before superior British numbers and training. The successful assault demonstrated that the Continental Army could take the offensive and achieve decisive results against seasoned opponents. The treatment of the Hessian prisoners continued to generate positive consequences for the American cause. Word of Washington's magnanimous conduct spread throughout the German states, where many potential mercenaries were recruited. The knowledge that American forces fought according to the accepted rules of warfare, treating prisoners with respect and dignity, helped counteract British propaganda that portrayed the colonists as savage rebels, unworthy of civilized consideration. The personal impact on Washington himself was profound. The successful crossing of the Delaware and the victory at Trenton had established his reputation as a general capable of bold, strategic thinking and flawless execution under pressure. The Continental Congress, which had been questioning his leadership after the defeats in New York, now granted him expanded powers and renewed their commitment to the war effort. For the common soldiers who had endured the crossing and fought in the battle, Trenton became a source of pride that sustained them through the remaining years of the war. These men, many of whom had been on the verge of desertion just days earlier, now saw themselves as part of something larger than their individual suffering.
Ow.
They had proven that American determination could overcome professional military training and superior equipment. The Battle of Trenton ultimately saved the American Revolution at its darkest hour. Without this victory, the Continental Army might have dissolved entirely during the winter of 1776 to 1777, leaving the British to consolidate their control over the rebellious colonies. Instead, Washington's bold gamble reinvigorated the Patriot cause and demonstrated that the struggle for independence was far from over. As Washington looked back across the Delaware River on that cold December morning, he could not have known that his desperate night crossing would be remembered as one of the most crucial moments in American history. The image of the general standing in the bow of a boat, crossing the ice-choked river to strike a blow for liberty, would inspire future generations of Americans facing their own moments of crisis. The victory at Trenton proved that sometimes, when everything seems lost, courage and determination can still change the course of history.